Good morning, everyone. So I was very pleased to have the cup of coffee with Tina a number of months ago because I really welcome the opportunity to contribute to this conference. As was already mentioned this morning, it's very important that the financial sector engages with the sustainability agenda, and I'll come back to that in a minute or two. Let me also say that the central bank itself, in terms of our own new building, the transformation of the central bank, we've very much benefited from the guidance of business in the community in developing our own corporate social responsibility and sustainability activities. In advance, let me congratulate the companies that will be awarded here today with the Business Working Responsibly mark. I think there's no substitute for having independent accreditation based on a comprehensive set of criteria. And I know this because we're also looking at this, and I think we're going to try to see if we can attain the mark next year. And we're working through those criteria now. So let me try to do two things in the time I have. Along one perspective, I want to talk about the interaction between the financial system and sustainability, and especially the role of the central bank along that dimension. And then second, I also want to talk about how the central bank as an individual institution is addressing this agenda. Let me also say, by the way, what I'm going to talk about is a little bit narrow compared to what we just heard about, because of course financing for sustainability includes a very large public component in terms of the public investment requirements for sustainable infrastructure, and also in terms of there's really an essential role for international aid, so cross-border transfers. Again, the private sector can do a lot, but it's not going to do everything. So those public dimensions are for other contributors to talk about. Okay, so let me first of all address the issue about how the financial system can support sustainability. And let me address the first question you might have is, what does this have to do with central banking? So Mark Carney, he has made striking contributions, but there was a lot of question marks about, what exactly is the mandate of a central bank? Why is a central bank dealing with this kind of topic? Now, I think there are good answers to that, which I'm going to come to. Now, one basic answer is a precondition for implementing strategic long-term policies that can support sustainability. A basic precondition is stability of the macro-financial system. So at both domestic and international levels, the basic lesson that we all painfully learned during the boom-bust cycle between 2003 and 2009, the European sovereign debt crisis between 2010 and 2012, and what we've seen in terms of the very slow and protracted adjustment dynamic since then, is essentially a lot of time and effort and attention can be diverted to short-term issues if the financial system becomes unstable. So that's for several reasons. One is, during periods of instability, there's uncertainty about the future path for the economy. And if we don't know where we're going in terms of the potential of the economy, it's very difficult for decision makers, whether private decision makers or public decision makers, to work out what is the sustainable path for investment, for example. Second, at a basic level, financial crises are very costly in terms of the fiscal position, so that if we have financial crises, it's going to divert resources from investing in long-term targets. A basic issue is bandwidth, that if all of the energy of the political system is absorbed with crisis management, then there's less left over in terms of the ability to focus on long-term issues. Another basic issue is boom-bust cycles are very wasteful of resources. To take an obvious example, the history of the construction sector in Ireland over the last 15 years provides a case study of how untamed credit can contribute to severe misallocation of resources, both across time and across geographies in terms of the inappropriate locations, non-sustainable locations for housing, for example. So that's a pretty basic, you might think a little bit boring contribution the central bank can make, which is only through tying down financial stability can the investment community, can the wider policy community focus on sustainability. So how do we do this? Well, we have what we call microprudential instruments and macroprudential. So the micro tools we have are capital ratios, liquidity ratios on individual firms, which is backed up by intensive supervision and inspections. At the macro level, the infrastructure now means that we can impose additional capital buffers and risk rates in recognition of systemic risk factors. In addition, we have borrower-based measures such as loan-to-income, loan-to-value ceilings in relation to mortgages in order to prevent collective overborrowing by households. So these days, you're going to see last week or the week before, we announced what are called OC buffers. So OC means other systemically important institutions, and we listed out a number of firms in Ireland which, because they're so systemically important, have to hold more capital to guard against downturns. Another instrument that we now look at every 90 days, every 3 months, is called the counter-cyclical capital buffer, the CCYB, which essentially is there if we detect this starting to be overheating in the credit cycle, this can be raised. And that's kind of an early intervention to limit the risks of excessive credit. Now, so far, we haven't pushed that trigger yet because credit in Ireland remains subdued in the aggregate. Although there's new lending going on, a lot of households, a lot of firms are still just paying down old debt. So in the aggregate, credit is not particularly strong at the moment. Having said that, across Europe, more and more countries are starting to push the button on the counter-cyclical capital buffer, and I think we will be looking at that very closely in the coming years. By the way, another dimension of maintaining financial stability is what we call recovery and resolution regimes. So we know during the crisis here and elsewhere, one basic contagion factor was trying to keep open banks that should have been shut down. Now, at the time, the bankruptcy regimes didn't allow for us to shut down banks in a safe, stable manner. Now we have that regime designed and it's increasingly being implemented, and that's going to be important in the future. So here in Ireland, we're the National Resolution Authority, and we work with the EU-level Single Resolution Board for the larger institutions. So, step one is essentially only through maintaining stability can sustainability be a proper focus. Let me now turn more broadly to what are the implications of environmental sustainability for the financial system. So at a general level, a basic function of the financial system is to allocate resources to expanding sectors and withdraw resources from contracting sectors. Now, this is easiest if structural change unfolds at a gradual pace. So natural adjustment mechanisms can facilitate the decline of unsustainable sectors and support the expansion of sustainability-enhancing sectors. So the glide adjustment model is easiest to support. However, if there's a sudden shift in economic and financial structures, this is going to be much more disruptive in terms of the capacity of the financial system to absorb losses on loans and investments in entities that require restructuring or outright bankruptcy. So this basic calculus is relevant in assessing the implications for the financial system of adapting to lower carbon intensity. A gradual transition is feasible if there are sufficient early policy interventions to set the world economy on a clear path towards a sustainable future. Alternatively, if adjustment is delayed, By the same logic, there's going to be an elevated risk of sudden and disruptive shift in carbon intensity at some point in the future. So you have a basic choice. We basically have a choice as a global society about gradual and steady versus delayed and sudden. Now, in the delayed and sudden scenario, this is going to have adverse consequences for the financial system. But let me emphasize through two mechanisms. One is through direct exposures to carbon-intensive firms, which could suddenly lose value, lose viability. But more broadly, if the world is being asked to make a sudden shift in terms of its carbon mix, that's going to lead to a pretty significant recession. So on the supply side, the productive capacity of the world economy is going to be compromised if carbon-intensive technologies have to be switched off very quickly. And on the demand side, this scenario of a sudden disruptive transition will lead to a pullback of investment and consumption. So whether you're a firm that's directly lending or investing in carbon-intensive sectors, you're at risk, but basically the whole system is at risk from the wider recessionary impact. So no one is safe in that scenario. So given that risk factor, a very basic building block was already mentioned, which is climate-related financial disclosures, and more broadly, the logic of disclosing other types of non-financial exposure. So this is why the Financial Stability Board, which is essentially a global platform for financial regulation, sponsored the task force, which was chaired by Mike Bloomberg, and which released its final set of recommendations this summer. And the basic message from the task force is that it is essential for firms to make consistent climate-related financial risk disclosures. So let me emphasize consistency. There's all sorts of initiatives around the world about disclosures. But if people are using different definitions, different criteria and so on, it's very inefficient in terms of working out which firms are most at risk. So number one, only if firms make these disclosures can the financial system make risk assessments in terms of lending decisions, investing decisions. And for us as regulators, in order for it to work out the systemic risks, for example, through stress testing carbon exposures, we need that basic information. Now, the task force is just one example. I think the central banking community has been a leader in working and publishing on these financial risks, whether in relation to banks, in relation to insurance companies, and so on. So let me remind you of the important work done by the Bank of England and the Prudential Regulatory Authority in the UK. At a European level, and I was involved myself in this work, the European Systemic Risk Board has published on these climate-related issues. And more broadly, there's a lot of activity in the financial regulatory community to prepare for the carbon transition. No prediction about when any of these risks may materialize, but we have to be prepared. Let me also emphasize that such disclosures are also important in guiding the asset allocation decisions of end investors. And end investors care for two reasons. One is, even if you don't care about the environment, you may recognize it's a material financial risk factor if you're exposed to climate risk. But more broadly, there is here we are talking about the role of firms, but I think more broadly around the world, there's plenty of evidence that more and more end investors, institutions on behalf of households, wealthy individuals, wealthy families, do want to be assured that the investments they make respect environmental, social, and governance criteria. So this ESG asset class is clearly rising in importance, and I'm guessing Rick may come back to this later on. So I think, as I mentioned, really that this is a bottom line issue for many firms. It's a bottom line issue for regulators, and there's no going back on this. It's now totally embedded in how we work and how we think about the future, because it's such a clear and obvious trigger factor. Carbon is a common global risk factor, and we'd be very remiss if we did not try and address that. Now, the clock tells me I have 5 minutes, so let me try and give you a little bit of a flavour of our own work at the central bank. So this is a bit of a gear shift to much more local and individual. Now, why should you care about the central bank's own work? Well, number one, as the regulator of 10,000 firms, I think we do have a kind of leadership or demonstration effect for the firms in the financial sector. So, you know, we are conscious of that role model type perspective. And second, of course, we've just moved. We've moved down to a new building in North Wall Quay. And the opportunity of moving to a new building, of course, allowed us to make sure, well, let's step forward in a good way, not just in terms of the design of the building, but we have a kind of related set of changes in how we work and other types of dimensions of the overall CSR and sustainability agenda. You know, I think we are quite happy with our new building. In July, it received the Royal Institute of Architects Universal Design Award. Those involved in the design heavily were focused on making sure it's 100% green, renewable in terms of energy usage. And for a building of the size, the BER rating of A2 is, I think, quite exceptional. Let me emphasize the original building, which was intended for some other institution whose name I've forgotten, was a C3 rating. So the difference between C3 to A2 is about a 70% saving in terms of energy usage. And our commitment is to make an energy saving target of 33% by 2020, which is in line with the National Energy Efficiency Action Plan for the public sector. Now, the way we work, at the same time as moving to a new building, we changed our technologies. And essentially now people have much more mobile technology, big emphasis on avoiding, you know, it's not totally possible. I've got a printed speech this morning, for example, but we do try and cut down on printing, and so far in the first number of months, it's come down by about a quarter, which is a decent start, but I wouldn't say it's it. Let me emphasize, and you know, whenever you have a quiet evening, you may want to click on yourself, is historically, if you wanted to consult our archives, you'd have to come in with limited access. Now we've put a very extensive catalogue on the web. So again, that's it's a good, I think, social initiative, and saves people, provides much more accessibility for that. We now have a new visitor centre, so in terms of opening up to the public, it's a much more open building, and we have, I think, very interesting exhibits in the visitor centre, which is open every day. Through Culture Night and Open House, we've also had many people coming through in recent months. But probably the most effective outreach initiative we do is every year we go to the National Ploughing Championships. And that's just such an amazing way to connect with so many people. Let me emphasize also, in terms of the work of the bank is mentioned earlier on in terms of diversity and inclusion. And this is absolutely an area that we think the dual role of our institution is important. So within the bank, this is very much a priority in terms of our own workforce, in terms of the way we conduct business ourselves. But absolutely the evidence is really strong in the financial sector that, it's not just correct on its own terms, but having diversity among senior decision makers, we think the evidence is compelling in terms of leading to better decision making. And then let me just finally conclude I think I mentioned at the start that essentially sustainability requires private finance, it requires public finance, it requires international aid. And equally, in terms of the role of our own staff, we would recognise that it would be an incomplete way of working just to work for the central bank's agenda. So we're very pleased that we have a staff-led charity committee that partners with a number of charities in terms of fundraising and outreach. And our staff members are, a good number volunteer with initiatives such as Early Learning Initiative and Junior Achievement Ireland in terms of the link to the local schools in particular. So, this again is partly for its own value, but we would fully recognise, as I mentioned earlier on, in terms of investors embracing the ESG agenda, it's absolutely the case. It's noticeable in our recruitment that the workers looking to see, well, where can I work, especially in a tight labour market, as we've seen here, really place a heavy premium on working for firms that they can be proud of in terms of their CSR commitment. So we're very pleased to pursue that. We're very pleased to be part of this community this morning, and I look forward to the rest of today's programme. Thank you very much.